Well, we did finish the album that way because we finished it in lockdown. But actually, the genesis of the project was me and Gavin in a room together, jamming on bass and drums. So it was very much a face-to-face experience. But I think by necessity, we ended up having to do it with the dreaded file sharing. Yeah. Anyway, not through choice, but although you kind of like working that way, don't you? You like working with file sharing.
Yeah.
I think it can be a part of the process, yeah.
Yeah, I think because of the nature of what I do, you can be too pressurised being in a studio. It could take a long time. Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it evolves in the early process,
Yeah.
I think, because that dictates so many other things. So, in fact, that's the environment you want to work with is to get that mood first. Because if the mood wasn't there, then you're working on the specifics of notation and time signatures, and so quite early on you want to introduce that kind of the more emotional side into it, and if there's lyrics there as well, that's a help at the early stages, even if they're just guide lyrics. That always helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mood is there from the very, very first moments of a track. The mood of the track, whether it's the rhythm or the keyboard sound or whatever it is that is the very, very core basis of a track, actually dictates everything else. The lyrics, the rest of the song grows from that seed in a way.
Yeah.
So I think it's there. I don't think, just not disagreeing with you, but I think in our case, the mood is actually the flavour of the song, the musical world is there from the very, very first moment.
Yeah, and the production is sort of there from the start and just progresses, as does the mix. I mean, I find when I work on my own, I don't really mix my albums. They mix themselves as you go along until you stop and you know the track's done.
Yeah.
And you have your mix because you've been tweaking it all the way through the process.
Which I think is very different. People make records now. They couldn't make those records in that way in the 70s and 80s, could they?
No, exactly.
But now we can save on a computer and go back years later and just pick up where we left off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that about modern recording. Yeah.
I tend to mostly use analog, with Porcupine Tree, definitely. They're just, it's hard to describe the difference, but they do make a difference. And being able to be hands-on with something, again, that's such it's a creative process. You feel, it's hard to feel there's emotion, but there's something happening, which I imagine, violinists or guitarists have, but they're in touch with their instrument. I mean, Brian Eno said the synthesizer was an instrument in development. And it is, because it hasn't necessarily stopped. There's no limits to what you can do with it. It can be anything at any time. So I find that process interesting, and usually it has to generally be analog to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I find there's a much more tactile relationship between analog keyboard and the music, because it's almost like you're painting, isn't it? You're playing notes, but you're also turning knobs, and it's alive. It's alive in your hands, and I love that about analog keyboards. Yeah. Yeah,
you can't do that with looking up menus.
No, you can't. No. Yeah. Going through menus, like get to the page. Oh yeah, that.
Yeah.
It's just all these knobs in front of you, and it's a very organic, and it's also very unpredictable.
Yeah.
I love that about analog keyboards. They're not predictable.
That's a good yeah. I mean, there are virtual analogs now and digital versions of that, and they make replicas that are amazing, but you don't get that instability and that randomness that you will get from something that is changing in temperature, changing in voltage. It's drifting.
I mean, again, I'm not a purist. Some of the guitars on this record, for example, were guitars which were the guitar literally plugged directly into the the computer and virtual amp modeling going on. And it's funny because when you do that, I found this time and time again in my musical career, when you do things thinking that they're just going to be temporary. Oh, I'll just get this guitar part down now because, well, I've got it in my head. I'll just stick it through this shitty amp and this shitty mic and just quickly put it down. And then later on you go back and you try and replace it. It's not as good. Something about the whole of the rest of the track has grown out. The signature of the track, the sort of the audio signature of the track has come from this shitty guitar sound. Of the New Day is a great example of that. That first guitar, it's a very plain sound. It was very put down just as a placeholder. And then I could never find another sound that I thought was as appropriate. Better, yes, but didn't sound right in the song anymore.
No, that happened on a few other tracks as well. Gavin and I preferred the original sound, and Stephen said, well, that was just the first thing I played. That was
And with vocals as well.
Yeah,
vocals. I think I redid the end of Harridan, and you're like, no, I like the way you sang it before because it sounded broken.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but technically it's shit. And you said, well, that's why we like it. So I think, that you have to. I think you have to be a little bit open to that and able to accept sometimes that first thought is often best thought. Again, going back to this idea of happy accidents.
Yeah, and also when you're in the creative process, you rush things along. You get something you really like, and then you're eager, because you've got these ideas, you're eager to move forward and add something to that. Of course, 2 weeks later, when you're trying to recreate what you first did, it's gone. I mean, my sounds, I haven't saved them because they're on old analog synths, so there's no patches to save them. I've worked on it, I've forgotten about that and moved on. I've lost the sequence, it didn't remember it,
I think that's for me, a problem with a lot of modern recording. I think why so much modern music is so anodyne and so bland is because people tend to perfect things to the point where they erase the personality. And a lot of personality comes from human frailties, imperfections. A vocal is much more affecting and powerful if you can hear the human frailties behind it. So much vocal music now, so much modern pop music I hear, the vocal is auto-tuned to perfection. There's nothing left that I relate to as a human being in that. And I listen to an old Van Morrison vocal or an old Aretha Franklin vocal. It's pure heart and soul, and it's not perfect. The tuning is not perfect. The intonation is not perfect. The timing is not perfect. Gets me right there.
You know what? Probably because they didn't have much studio time.
Yeah.
They just went in and did it.
Bashed it out.
And that's why I think a lot of when people work at home in this way, they can come up with these interesting sounds. Whereas if you were in a studio, the engineers, you were out there for ages. The engineers trying to get the perfect guitar sound, the perfect bass sound. It's just wasting time.
Yeah, and I know. I think it's one of the lessons that we don't seem to have learned. Us in the music industry, that one of the reasons we love all these old records is because they're not perfect. The drummer is speeding up and slowing down.
Yeah.
The singer is going in and out of tune. The bass player's in and out of the pocket the whole time. The guitars are slightly out of tune. Listen to some old Who records. The guitar's slightly out of tune, but it's got so much character, so much personality. Ian Curtis, pitching is terrible on the Joy Division songs, but wow, what a voice, and Robert Smith, The Cure, again, Morrissey.
He's a great singer.
He's a great singer, but his pitching was terrible. But I love it. Don't get me wrong, I love it. And I'm saying that's why I love his singing, because it's not perfect. And now everything gets tweezed and perfected by software. Anyway, we sound like old men now, don't we? Anyway, that's what we're talking about with the, you asked me the question of how I record the guitars and the bass. Very, very quickly to start with, without thinking about it, and then I try and go back much later and go through fancy amps with fancy guitars and super amazing microphones and try to better what I've done, but very often find that I can't, and that I like the shitty sound I got in the first place when I wasn't even thinking about it. pedals, plugins. I'm not a purist. I think it's amazing what you can do these days. You know, for all we're talking about how we love analog equipment, I think there are also amazing things you can do now with digital plugins, which kind of abstract, process sound in ways that we never could have done with analog equipment. So I think the combination of analog and digital for me is a world I love. I love the combination of the two things. I mean, I think, you know, leading on from what I was saying before, I think the notion of demos now is kind of irrelevant, because you are moving towards the finished art. In fact, Richard alluded to this. You're moving towards the finished article pretty much from the very first moment you play one note. So the demo now becomes the basis for the finished master, and there's no longer this thing where you do a version of the song and then you re-record it from scratch again. What you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. So there are vocals on this record. There are guitar parts on this record. There are bass parts on this record. There are even drum parts on this record that were created at the very inception of the track. Literally within 2 minutes of having the idea, it had been played, performed, recorded, documented, and it was never re-recorded. So the notion of demo to finish recording, that division no longer applies, I think.